Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's August 25th, 2021. Let me begin by wishing you, Helga, on behalf of myself, our viewers, and your fans, a very, very happy birthday today. Now, we're in the midst of an incredible situation where your leadership has been absolutely crucial in trying to cut through the nonsense in the media, the finger pointing, and everything else. It was 10 days ago that the Taliban marched into Kabul. This has really overturned a lot of what has been accepted as the axioms of the geopolitical world. Uh, let's just start with the failure of the endless war. This is pretty conclusively demonstrated now, isn't it?
Yes, I said immediately when the decision was clear that the US and NATO troops would leave that this was a change, maybe not quite as significant as the fall of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but of that type, namely that a whole system is coming to an end, namely the right to protect humanitarian interventions, the endless wars of the last 20 years, because this policy clearly has completely failed. And while the earthquake rumblings are still to be heard in the media, in all the politician statements, I mean, what is coming out now is, not only was the Iraq war based on lies, I mean, that has been discussed in this show many times, but, we also discussed, the failure of the Afghanistan policy. We published a white book in 2010 already. Then you had in 2019 the Afghanistan papers, and now it's coming out. Nobody can overlook that evidence that this was a whole fraud all along. They spent $2 trillion on what? On basically making dirty deals with warlords, with not nation building, not building any infrastructure or economic development of any way worth talking about. And now the Taliban was able to, to basically defeat the Afghanistan army. Why? Because they did not believe in the order which was, promised to them. So also, it now turns out the Afghanistan army was badly paid. Some of them were hungry. So the motivation was absolutely not there. And the significance of this is a failure of the neoliberal system, big time. And I think this is being recognized by everybody. There are tons of articles everywhere, in the Western media lamenting. But I think if you compare the attitude, taken in the Western mainstream media and most politicians, and compare that to the very, very different attitude coming from the neighbors, primarily Pakistan, the Central Asian republics, Iran, Russia, China, they have a completely different attitude. Namely, they say the most important thing now is to stabilize the situation. So we should discuss this, because I think that difference is what is really striking and telling about who is who in this picture.
I think to start looking at that, we should take up what happened at the G7 event, where there was an effort from the British in particular to change the terms of what Biden had said about leaving on August 31st. And Biden rejected that, and the British have not stopped gnashing their teeth and complaining about that.
Well, first of all, I find it noteworthy that Biden said something I think, in response to some reporters. He said that the Taliban is now confronted with the task to take care of the well-being of the Afghanistan people, and that is something which for hundreds of years was not attempted by anybody. Now, I thought that remark was extremely telling. First of all, it's true. The Taliban now is confronted with the fact that, the only way how they can maintain power, they have to address the hungry people. 1 of 3 Afghani people are going hungry every day, are food insecure. There is a very poor health system in the middle of a pandemic. So the Taliban must do something, to stabilize the situation, which is recognized by, as I said, the neighbors. And Biden addressed that. I thought this was important because that has not been a consideration by, NATO, obviously, because, after 20 years, they leave the country in a impoverished, terrible condition. So the British naturally are completely freaked out because they wanted to drag on. Boris Johnson had called the G7 in his capacity. I think he's Britain is chairman of the G7 for this time. So the meeting was convened, and he did not succeed to convince Biden to prolong the date beyond the August 31st, which has been already rejected by the Taliban. They regard the NATO as an occupying force, and they want to stop that. And I'm not making judgment on everything the Taliban stands for, but they regard NATO as an occupying force. They regarded their war as a war of independence, rejecting the foreign occupation, and therefore they did not prolong this deadline. Now that is now causing an incredible freak out. Tony Blair, the architect, or probably one of the architects of this entire unholy interventionist war policy. Remember his infamous speech in Chicago in 1999, where he basically said, now the Peace of Westphalia order is basically finished. We have to protect democracy and human rights. And that was the beginning of giving the theoretical underpinning for the right to go into somebody else's country, create havoc, millions of deaths, and then leave it, under shameful conditions. So this guy basically called the idea to end the endless wars an imbecilic policy. Now, attacking Biden, now that I think is very revealing, and there's a huge freak out ever since that the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain is destroyed, it's finished. You have Lord Darroch, the former UK ambassador in Washington, saying this is the end of global Great Britain, global Britain. And, he was the one who had said we have to flood the environment of Trump to make sure that there's a complete controlled environment around it. Then he had to leave early in 2019. So there are other people in Great Britain absolutely beyond themselves, besides themselves. There is a certain Colonel Kemp, a former British commander of the British troops in Afghanistan, who said, unlike some Republican congressmen in the United States who demand the resignation of Biden, he said that Biden should be court-martialed. I mean, these people are completely off the wall. And there was one commentary which I thought was quite interesting, saying that the fact that Biden did not consult with the British on making this decision to not prolong the date beyond end of August basically means that global Great Britain is just two empty words. And I think this is true because the special relationship between the UK and Great Britain, which was really the basis of this war policy, the unipolar world, run on the basis of the British Empire. You get the British brain and the American muscle to, subdue the world. That has now been blown apart. And, I think this is a very, very useful outcome, especially because everybody can see the shameful result of this policy.
I think it's important to note that what Blair was saying was not that he disagreed with the way that the withdrawal took place. he disagreed with the idea of ending an endless war. That's what he was calling imbecilic. So it was attacking Biden. It was also attacking Trump. It was attacking the people in America who are opposed to continuing this war. Now, Helga, I think it's important you mentioned the neighbors. We see an effort underway from Pakistan, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others to provide aid in the same way that you had been calling for. The opposition to that is the people who still think there's a military solution, including the neocons who want to arm the resistance and so on. I think it's important that we've had now two conferences where we've laid out a strategy for helping the people in Afghanistan, stabilizing the situation. And I'd like you to just contrast that with these idiots who are saying we need to continue the war.
Well, Bolton and Bill Kristol, the neocon, they're actually touring the United States, calling for arming the opposition. And there is a certain opposition in this valley in the north east. They want to continue the war by all means. I think the good thing is that the suffering of the Afghanistan people could come to an end, provided there is now an economic development policy. Now, we had a conference on this subject on the 31st of July. This was about 10 days before the Taliban took over. And this was quite prescient because we laid out both the historic geopolitical significance, namely that it has the potential to end geopolitics, and a program how to integrate Afghanistan into the development projects of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, that conference was quite important because, we defined what is the solution about 2 weeks before the explosion occurred. And that has been recognized by many publications around the world, which, reported about our conference. And, I think we are regarded as a very important voice in bringing the forces together who need to work together. And that is emphatically the neighbors. The Pakistan right now is really playing a very important role because they want to extend the China-Pakistan economic corridor into Kabul, into Central Asia. There has been an agreement already made before these developments, so that can actually go. The Pakistani Foreign Minister Qureshi just was on a tour to Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. He also went to Iran. There are also massive phone calls and meetings involving Russia, China. And, China said very clearly they are ready to involve, to invest in the Belt and Road Initiative in Afghanistan. Now, it is very clear, the CFR, Council of Foreign Relations, the British, everybody who hates this policy, they say, the Chinese will not invest. It's too insecure, meaning, they want to create so much chaos that they deter China from continuing. But I think, the overwhelming dynamic is, there is a new dynamic involving, Russia, China, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan, Iran. It is still a little bit difficult with India, but many people think India will come around because it is just the connectivity of the whole region. It doesn't matter if you call it Belt and Road Initiative or connectivity, as long as it is the same idea that you open up the landlocked areas of the Eurasian continent through infrastructure projects, which basically give these landlocked areas the same advantage like areas which are otherwise on the seaside or on rivers. So for the Central Asian republics, this is the way to go, and all of Asia is going in this direction. So my point and our point has been from the very beginning, that this is a moment where, one has to reflect that this policy was wrong. It was defined wrong. I mean, this is clear. We have now soon the 20th anniversary of 9/11. This war was defined wrongly from the beginning. Bin Laden was one thing, but what does Afghanistan have to do? They could have looked at Saudi Arabia, for example. The evidence that the Saudis played a role in that was much, much bigger. So anyway, the war was defined badly from the beginning, and it should have not lasted for 20 years. There are many, many soldiers who are suffering. They have damages to their psychological well-being, post-traumatic disorders. Their families are in a havoc. So I think there is now a time to reflect. And the best thing which could happen is that the Europeans and the United States would cooperate. Michele Geraci, former part of the Italian government, he said, the Silk Road is so much more attractive than the tank road. And that is a recognition which is now being understood by many, many forces in the world. And therefore, I don't see it happening yet, because, the Europeans are still behaving quite idiotic, in my view. The best thing which can happen, and the only thing which will give a way out of this, is that people in Germany, in other European countries, in the United States, say, okay, we have to make this thing work, and we have to cooperate with Russia and China and the neighbors, to build up Afghanistan as a functioning, well, integrated economy. And infrastructure always has an incredible impact on the people who are doing it. So if you want to have an improved situation with the Taliban, then cooperate with them in the economic construction of the country. And I think that is what's going to happen, at least concerning the neighbors, and the big neighbors and the small neighbors. So I think there is a completely new dynamic, and we had a second conference where we reflected on that with such people as Ray McGovern, who has a lot of insights into the situation. Also Pino Arlacchi, former UN representative in the fight against drugs, and he actually brought a lot of interesting elements in it. Like, he had a deal with the Taliban in 2000, before 9/11, basically, where the Taliban had completely agreed to give up opium production, and then the opium production exploded after the US and the British, in particular in Helmand province, moved in. And there are ways to solve this problem, and that's what we are trying to fight for.
And it's also clear that you can't airlift 30 million people from Afghanistan out of the country, so you have to deal with the problems there. Now, in this context, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on this Asian tour being undertaken by Vice President Harris, who is in China lecturing the Chinese about the rules-based order. Any thoughts on that?
It's almost a subject for laughter, because after this so-called rules-based order just collapsed in shambles, this woman has the nerve to go and lecture the Chinese on the so-called rules-based order. And you should read some of the absolutely sarcastic comments in the Chinese press, where they basically say, what is this rules-based order? You go into a country outside of the UN international law, you create havoc, you create mountains of corpses and millions of refugees, then you leave in a hurry, you don't even coordinate with your allies, and then you call this a rules-based order. There are tons of articles saying, the West, which is still clinging to this idea that there is such a thing as a rules-based order outside of the United Nations, which is generally recognized as the only body representing international law, is just out of sync with time, out of reality. It's a reactionary mindset, totally incapable of understanding the dynamic of the time. And that is how people look at it. And I think people like Kamala Harris just make themselves ridiculous and a laughing stock.
Now, another situation that is emerging is the effort to use Crimea and Ukraine as a stumbling block between changing relations between especially the US and Russia and Europe and Russia. There's this conference, the Crimea Platform Summit, which obviously was trying to stir this thing up. The Russians had a very strong reaction to that, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, Zelensky, I don't know what happened to this person, because when he made the election campaign, he sounded quite different. And somehow something or somebody got to him, and he now is, on the forefront of this effort to get Ukraine into NATO, to have, as many maneuvers. And now this platform, which is supposed to, put together an international coalition to undo the referendum in Crimea. Now, remember, there was never an annexation of Crimea by Russia. It was the Crimea population which reacted to the coup in Kiev, which involved a lot of Nazi elements in the Stepan Bandera tradition, and then people in the Crimea, said absolutely no to that. I mean, that has been distorted many times. So the idea to undo that is just a recipe for disaster. But I think the Russian national security chief, I think is his position, Patrushev, he said, people should look at what happened to the allies in Afghanistan, and they should watch out that the United States obviously is not very reliable, and it could happen to them what just happened in Afghanistan. So I think this is part of a effort, but I mean, NATO is discredited, and I mean, NATO should have dissolved when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. They have lost their raison d'etre, 30 years ago. And that was stated also by the president of the Czech Republic, Zeman, who basically said that Czech Republic should stop wasting money on NATO and spend the money for the national defense instead. And I think, NATO is not any longer a defensive alliance. It's not limited to the North Atlantic. They have now global ambition. They want to go into the Indo-Pacific, global NATO, as Stoltenberg calls it. And I think the NATO should be dissolved, and it should be replaced by an international security architecture which takes care of the security interest of every single nation. Because if you have learned anything from international treaties and alliances, if they don't take care of the interest of everybody, they are the seed for disaster. So I would say dissolve NATO, look at, for example, the idea of a Eurasian integration from the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the European Union, and then include the United States and make a new international security architecture involving everybody. That is a reasonable solution. And I think everything else is going to lead to a catastrophe.
Now, another absolutely urgent situation, which has somewhat been lost in all the coverage of Afghanistan, is what's happening in Haiti right now, where you had an earthquake, you've had tropical storm, a country where there are many parts of it which are inaccessible to aid. This would be another area where we should have international cooperation to address not just the current crisis, but the endemic poverty, the danger from the pandemic, and so on.
Well, Haiti is a small country. And, when this earthquake happened 10 years ago, 2010, nothing was really done. And therefore, this is a population, it's devastated. There are already now 2,200 people dead for sure, many more missing, many more living in absolute horrendous conditions. And I think, this is the moral stain on the character of the West if we cannot solve a problem like that. Spending trillions and trillions on making the rich richer by, having more stimulus packages, more quantitative easing, more, craziness, uh, also on military budgets. But when it comes to saving a small country, which clearly has not the means to save itself, we are failing. So I would really call on people to rethink that, because I think, last in the final analysis, which system will survive is going to be the question. Which system has the moral fitness to survive? And I think the value of life clearly right now is not protected by the West. China just managed to go back to zero COVID infections by, isolating the new outbreaks very efficiently, very quickly. And it shows you an attitude towards life. So I would call on, people to really rethink that, because we have called for the creation of a modern health system in every single country as an answer to the pandemic. And that remains the number one priority in my agenda.
Now, one other thing we should take up is there's a virtual conference that's going to take place this Friday, the annual Jackson Hole retreat of the Federal Reserve. 2 years ago, of course, this is where Mark Carney and Fink from BlackRock and their whole team of former central bank officials called for a financial regime change. They're still intent on this. They're still continuing the same policy. What do you think is going to come out of this, and what are the implications, given what you just talked about, that we have a situation where the most wealthy people are still trying to rig control of governments for their own benefit as opposed to the interests of the people?
Well, we have a big concern now coming out publicly everywhere about hyperinflation. The latest figures for Germany are 5%. There are big articles that this will eat up the savings of the pensioners and poorer parts of the population. And it is true, it's eating up savings, and it's becoming a big factor because it makes people who have very little already poorer. So I think that if you look at what happened in 1923 with the Reichsbank printing money and how quickly this hyperinflation exploded, I think, the possibility that there may be a discussion in Jackson Hole about the so-called tapering, meaning to go into an interest rate increase. There is a big pressure to go in this direction, but that could trigger a complete crash immediately, because it would make the debt bubble so much more expensive. So they're between a rock and a hard place, which is why what my late husband has advertised for a long time, you need a complete reorganization of the banking system. You have to make a Glass-Steagall banking separation globally, create a national bank in every country, and then have a new Bretton Woods system connecting these national banks in a credit system, essentially like Franklin D. Roosevelt had intended it with the original Bretton Woods system. And that is the way to go. And, I don't think in Jackson Hole this will be on the agenda, because this is all the hardcore monetarist, neoliberal, geopolitical, imperial, colonial faction, supported by what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey Met, which I find a very useful notion. It means military, industrial, congressional, academic, media, and think tank complex, Mickey Met. And that is really what is trying to manipulate the public opinion. But, I think their ability to do so becomes less and less, because people, there is a fundamental recognition that the neoliberal system does not take care of people. This was clearly in Afghanistan the case. It was not done during 20 years of the war. It was for sure not done in evacuating in time. It was not done for the workforce in Afghanistan who was helping the troops, the foreign troops. They are left now in a disarray. But also the same neglect was clearly in the dealing with the flood catastrophe in Germany, where now several weeks afterwards, there's still no real coordination. The population gets really desperate. There are suicides now rising. And again, people feel that there is no concern about the general welfare and the common good. And I think this is a sign of the time. So, this is what needs to be remedied if this system is not supposed to disintegrate in disarray.
Well, Helga, what you just described is what you've often referred to as a punctum saliens, a point at which everything seems to have been lost, but you have an opportunity for something new. What advice can you give our viewers and listeners about their personal state of mind, how they have to look at this so they're not paralyzed, but can actually take actions that will make a difference?
Well, I think first of all, one has to have a conception how the world should look like. And once you have a clear idea what could be done, for example, overcome poverty, not only in Africa, Latin America, Asia, but also in Europe. I think there are 90 million people who are on the verge of poverty, but not doing well. I have not seen the EU having any program to overcome poverty. There are pockets of third world kind condition, condition in the United States. I think the idea to end this insane green ideology, which would impoverish the people in the industrial countries and depopulate massively the people in the developing countries, that all must be put aside. And we have to have the idea of a development perspective. The immediate idea is, the Belt and Road Initiative is nothing but what Lyndon LaRouche and our movement has been working for the last almost 50 years, maybe 40, 45 years. The idea that you have to have a global development. And, the book we published in 2014, The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. I mean, this is a blueprint of what can be done, and it could be done very, very easily to overcome poverty, then get rid of this entire degenerate culture, which is right now, which has befallen most of the West, and go back to the classical traditions of Dante. We have the 700th years of Dante this year. He was a universal thinker, not just for Italy. We have the beautiful classical music tradition, the image of man associated with Nicolaus of Kues, Leibniz, Lessing, Schiller, Humboldt. I mean, there are so many ideas where you could give dignity and a beautiful image of man back to our civilization. I mean, the Asians are doing that. I mean, the Asians are both thinking about building a future. They think that the 21st century will be the year of Asia, but they are also, reaching back into their, in part, 5,000-year-old history, and reviving the best elements of that, and that gives them power. And we in the West are not doing that. We accept all kinds of Hollywood degeneracy, perversions, pornography, violence, meaningless games. If you think, what attention is being paid to the young people. I mean, young people need a mission. And fortunately, we see that right now in these flood destroyed areas in Germany, where a lot of young people come and help. And if that would be more organized around the world, what we try to do with the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, where you give young people a mission to help to remedy the problems we have, overcoming the famine, overcoming pandemic, helping people, it would be so easy to fix this world if this unfortunate greed of the super rich, the Wall Street types, the City of London types, if that would just be replaced. And I think it's undecent if people are already 2-digit billionaires and they want to get 3-digit billionaires. I think this should not be allowed. So anyway, look at the life work of Linda LaRouche. We had a beautiful event on the 14th of August. This was sponsored by the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. You should listen to that, because there you had speakers from around the world discussing the life work of my late husband. And there you find almost an answer to every single problem which is confronting us today. So there's reason for optimism, because solutions are there, provided you have the courage and the nerve to realize them.
Well, Helga, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for continuing to show the courage and optimism that you're calling for other people to demonstrate. I think you represent a good model for that. And again, have a happy birthday, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, thank you. Till next week.